And when I was living in Waianae in Hawaii, which is on the island of Oahu, I saw that same hopelessness or cycle of tragedy for many of our small farms that were farming as part of their cultural motivation or having historically done so, but suffered because they didn't quite have the opportunity of feeding people. So they were farming, but their produce didn't quite make it in to where most people were buying their food.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, NCAT agriculture specialist Gabriella Soto-Velez sits down with Dr. Saleh Azizi, director of the Hawai'i Food Hub Hui and the Islands and Remote Areas Regional Food Business Center. Together, they delve into the historical context of Hawaii's food system, exploring the impacts of colonialism and the resulting health challenges faced by the native population. Saleh explains the critical role of food hubs in supporting local agriculture and food security, and he and Gabriella discuss the unique collaboration between Hawaii's Regional Food Business Center, the Good Food Alliance Hawaii, and the U.S. Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition. Learn more about how these partnerships are shaping a more resilient and sustainable food system for island communities. Let's listen.
Hey there, everybody. This is Gabriella Soto-Velez from the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and I'm a sustainable ag specialist. And I'm very excited because today I'm here with Dr. Saleh Azizi from the Hawaii Good Food Alliance and the Hawai'i Food Hub Hui. And I had the pleasure of meeting him at the Island Food Summit in St. Croix this past February. And so today we're going to be speaking about the Regional Food Business Center, food hubs, the history of the food culture in Hawaii, and what the impact he's having there. So take it away, Saleh. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Aloha mai kako. Thank you for having me here, Gabriella, and good to see you again on the screen and talk to you. Even though you're far away, it's 11 o'clock where I'm at, and you're at 5 p.m., I believe. So yes, I am Saleh Azizi, and I'm born and raised actually in Sweden with ancestors from Iran or Persia. And it's a place that I never really had the fortune of going to as a refugee. We have a history of being war refugees in my family. And so we got disconnected from our roots and experienced quite a lot of upheaval as a child, which brought me to Sweden and then later to a Swedish family. And I came to Hawaii about 18 years ago as part of my studies in sustainable agriculture. I had started to travel around the world and gone to England for 1 year of college, gone to Australia. And immediately when I came to Hawaii, it wasn't necessarily the tropical beaches and the palms that made me stay here. It was really the aloha that people had to share with me. And that is a sense of inviting in, not only inviting us to be hospitable to with the hospitality to Hawaii, but also inviting me to find more about who I am as a person. And that's the effect that Hawaii has had on me. So, I make connections between my past and the things that I work with today. I experienced a lot of hopelessness as a young kid, and that became sort of the things that I wanted to provide solutions to. And when I was living in Waianae in Hawaii, which is on the island of Oahu, I saw that same hopelessness or cycle of tragedy for many of our small farms that were farming as part of their cultural motivation or having historically done so, but suffered because they didn't quite have the opportunity of feeding people. So they were farming, but their produce didn't quite make it in to where most people were buying their food. So that became part of my mission to do something about. Like I said, I lived there in Waianae for 10 years. We started something called Kahumana Food Hub, which then the food hub grew into a food hub network after a few years that I initiated. And this was all while I was completing my PhD in urban planning. And so in urban planning, I had advisors basically prompting me to study in a slightly different way. Don't go out to the community and portray yourself as an expert, but rather go out and listen, and listen deeply, really. Where is the community at? What are the things that they want that they haven't been able to achieve? And then how can you be able to record that and also to facilitate that change for the community? So everything I do is very bottom up, sort of participatory. But that's just a little bit about me and how I made it to Hawaii.
Thank you for sharing your background. That sounds like a really challenging past, and your travels really resonate with me because I had a tougher upbringing as well, and then I found a big community in my travels abroad living in France and Kenya, and so I really understand getting integrated into that community and really feeling inspired and wanting to create some type of impact and change. But let's reverse a little bit, and you were speaking about how the agricultural system in Hawaii is really struggling, and I think that that's really relevant because of the colonialist history. And so maybe you could give us just a brief understanding of how Hawaii's past and the battle with colonialism has impacted the food system now.
Yeah, absolutely. And by no means am I an expert on this topic, but I can share with you what I've learned from communities in Hawaii over time when I've lived here. And it's important for us to recognize and put right into the center of the conversation that Hawaii was once self-sufficient and thriving. There are historical records before Cook arrived here in Hawaii that we were doing agriculture here and feeding up to about 900,000 people, which is very close to current population. So we know we have a history of abundance, not only in the food that was growing, but in the culture that was promoting that growing of food. And then over time, a lot of disruption has taken place with colonization coming in, which in agriculture resulted in plantation agriculture. And what happened with plantation agriculture was that there was a huge shift from feeding yourself and your community to the idea of exporting food. And of course, when you're a plantation or when you're colonized, it was the idea of exporting to the colony, right? So sugar and pineapple, macadamia nuts, several large commodities became the focus of Hawaii's agriculture. And in order to produce those levels of industrial production, we brought in people from all over the world to live here, including Portugal, Philippines, Japan, China, South Korea, all the people that now have 3, 4, 5, 6 generations of folks living in Hawaii that came as plantation workers. But it has really changed the mentality of agriculture. And I think the destructive part is really the extractive nature. We just see the lands being cultivated and the produce being taken out and not at all benefiting the local community. So those are parts of, the realization of how can we establish a different food system? How can we establish what we would call at Hawaii Good Food Alliance a good food system, or much, much better than the food system that we currently see?
It's such a similar story all throughout the territories, and it's just really devastating the populations, especially the health impacts that it has on those cultures. So you were speaking about access to food, and so I know that you do work in the Hawai'i Food Hub Hui. Can you explain what is that and what even is a food hub for our listeners that don't really understand those words? And then how is it supporting the local agriculture? What does it do? How is it relative to agriculture and feeding the community?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to explain that. And I'll just back up a little bit and say that the Hawai'i Food Hub Hui is a program of the Hawaii Good Food Alliance. And so with the Good Food Alliance, on a very broad term, the social change that we want to see in our society is a shift from the current industrial and very extractive food system to a good food system that is, again, much better than what we're currently facing, and making good food viable for everyone. And so the 5 pillars that we see that standing on is that good food is culturally grounded. It connects us to who we are, our culture, and our heritage. Food is medicine for us, so food is a foundational part of our health and well-being. It's equitable. It promotes equity both to our farmers and to those who eat the food. It is community-based, and which also means that we actually have to meet the community where it's at. And then the 5th pillar is malama aina, which is a Hawaiian word and speaks to the reciprocal responsibility, or kuleana as we call it, between people and land and how we take care of one another. And so the Food Hub Hui really lives in this framework and works towards this much bigger goal. But food hubs in general, and when I started one in 2017 in Waianae, are an innovation. They're fairly new in the food system. They're really aimed at creating an alternative distribution system, because we found that most of the distribution systems that are in Hawaii are very focused on importing food. And so over 90% of the food that we consume in Hawaii comes from outside of Hawaii. And when you go and look at the large distribution company, they do not have room for small farms. On the other hand, small farms make up over 90%, another 90%. We have many 90% figures of the total number of farmers that we have in Hawaii. I recall this conversation that I had with one of our native Hawaiian farmers in Waianae, who grows on less than 5 acres, and he does aquaculture. His name is Bula, and he was one of the main reasons why we started the Food Hub in Waianae and at Kahumana. And he said, Saleh, when I went to the store to sell my lettuce, they just laughed at me. And that's the kind of disappointment and hopelessness, again, that I got into this to try to find solutions for. So most of our small farms do not have anywhere to take their produce unless they're lucky and make one connection with a restaurant or a store. And so food hubs are here to solve that. Food hubs have also now shown a track record of the last 5 years of paying farmers 70% of every dollar that they make. So they're really changing the equity in the food system. Our food hubs have also grown from a revenue of around $3 million in total back in 2017 to now around 18 million a year among the 14 food hubs in Hawaii. But our Hui really started because many of our food hubs were new. We had shared values and we got to know each other. And we felt, quite frankly, that we needed a support group. We needed to come together and talk. We didn't want to learn everything from scratch. Many of us had very alive, in a sense, social motivations, but did not know the technical skills of how to make that vision come true. So it was a hui of sharing with one another. How do you run a food hub? And also asking the bigger question, how do we make food hubs available to all farms in Hawaii? How do we establish those connections that we need between farmers and consumers?
Thank you for sharing that. When you were describing the 5 pillars, I was actually getting goosebumps because it is so powerful to think of food as equity and bringing people together, and medicine, and it's so sad that the people there just don't have access to their traditional foods, and they're just being fed these imported foods that they can't even really afford oftentimes. I wanted to touch on one of the farmers, Bola, that you were speaking of. And is the reason that these farmers aren't able to sell to markets because the imported foods outcompete the price in the stores? Or why is there this disconnect between local food being produced on the island, yet it can't be sold to stores and things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And the main reason that I found is that they are an inconvenience to the distributors because they're not huge, because they're not producing the same amount of food every week. because of that lack of having grown into that space, which many farms on the continent, have grown into, which then in turn for many of those large farms have created tons of waste. Because of not having gotten there, it's like we treat them as, well, you're just a hobby farmer. What you do is merely part of your way of life, and you have nothing to contribute to the food system. And so that's really what our food hubs are trying to disprove. And of course, what you said also plays a big role. In the long run, those prices that come from outside are much cheaper. Even though we've seen a balancing of that with COVID and inflation, is that actually in local food systems, we don't see the same amount of inflation as we see for the food that comes here. So in a sense, lettuce, tomatoes, and cucumbers that are grown here are now almost comparative in price. But it's quite a lot, because some of these farms, and I think one of the biggest changes that food hubs in Hawaii make is that they don't have experience with the marketplace. So the food hubs aren't just buying and selling food. They're actually educating and drawing in and pulling in producers and convincing them in the process that what you do is really important, and it can make it to the mainstream consumer. It doesn't just have to be given away. And in that process, many of the farms we work with have seen an increase over the years, where they would call me and say, hey, we're now hiring people on this, activity that used to be a part-time thing when I came home from work. And so those are really good things to see, and what we want to see.
That's so exciting. Thank you for helping me understand a little bit more the challenges. And I'm happy that things are developing a little bit more. And the numbers that you gave us, from 3 million to 18 million, is an amazing increase. So you must be really happy about how things are evolving there. Speaking about marketing, though, that kind of lets us segue into the Regional Food Business Center. And I would love if you could really explain to me how the Regional Food Business Center and the food hubs, how do they work together, and what impact are they really having in Hawaii?
Absolutely. And, when the opportunity came out from USDA, there was several food hubs in our network that approached me and said, Saleh, we should really go for this. This Regional Food Business Center is like lined up for what we do with our food hub network. And the same thing for the Good Food Alliance. You people saying you guys are the best umbrella in Hawaii for this. But then the challenge was immediately, this is not a project you can do as one state. You have to pair up with others. And how most people were pairing up was to the states right next to them in the continent. And we felt like, well, we don't really have any similarities to, the closest thing being California. We don't have similarities with agriculture in California. But through various forums, for example, we had an RFSP award where Alaska Food Policy Council was there. I was part of a Wallace Center training for value chain coordination. And through these various initiatives, bringing us into groups that are actually dealing with very similar challenges, we found a group of Alaska and all the other territories, and we just felt like family right away. Not only did we share that we were in places of cultural and historical abundance, but we also shared the disruption to our places, and we shared that as part of the solution that we're now trying to bring in, we're surrounded by leaders who are drawing on the past to move into the future. And so, partnering with Summer Sibley Brown from U.S. Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition, with Miguel from Puerto Rico and the Alliance for Agriculture, from Robbie with Alaska Food Policy Council, and Michelle and Marlin with Guahan Sustainable Culture out in Guam. We formed our Regional Food Business Center with all of those regions that I mentioned. So Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Alaska, Hawaii, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam. And we found that not only our history, but our current challenges are so similar. So we formed the only non-contiguous Regional Food Business Center.
The ATRA website has been connecting sustainable agriculture students and farmers around the country for decades. Our free internship hub makes it easy to find interns or farmers looking to hire interns. If you're looking for some practical experience on a working farm to bolster your studies, or you want to pass on the wisdom of your experience in exchange for some willing elbow grease, stop by at atra.ncat.org.
So that's a little bit about our connections. But now that we're in this group and we've been together for over a year now, Food Hub development is one of the main sort of focuses of this. And in some places like Hawaii and Alaska, we have a number of food hubs and we have networks. And so we're working at that level. And in some other places, they have small farms that are growing into creating food hubs. And so everybody is at a slightly different level with a different situation and different challenges. And we're creating learning groups, but also using our resources and grant money and technical assistance to help people develop food hubs.
Thank you. And I know that within the Regional Food Business Center, a lot of it is focusing on the development in agriculture within these territories. But could you further explain a little bit of the objectives that you have based on the unique challenges faced in the territories in Hawaii?
Yeah, so I think some of them I've touched a little bit on. If you look at the census of agriculture for Hawaii, we have roughly 6,500 farms. Over 90% of them are family farmers, and over 90% of them are small farms. And then you look at that number and you say, well, 90% are small farms. Well, those are actually the people that tell the USDA that they're farming. There's probably a number that's 3 or 4 times that large of people that are farming that are not calling themselves farmers. So one of our main challenges is actually, and opportunities, to be quite honest with you, because this is not just a challenge, this is actually quite a legacy that people in our regions grow food, and they grow quite a lot of food. But many of them are backyard growers. Many of them are smaller than small farms. So partly we're looking at how do we build support systems for that level of agriculture. A lot of our cultures are also trading, people are giving each other food. And in some instances, there's transactions, you could say, between farmers and people that consume the food that are not measured at all as part of our progress. And so that's another thing that we share, is that there's a lot more going on here than what's being measured. And just an example, when I was in Alaska, one of the numbers from Alaska is that 95% of the food that they eat is imported. And at the same time, another researcher presented a number that said 50% of any Alaskan's energy intake is directly from harvest or subsistence, right? So we know there's something wrong in those numbers, and we're not necessarily trying to change people's behavior to go to the store and buy food if they're also relying on their own food. And so those are some of the challenge. I think other challenges is really that many of us have left tons of resources on the table in Washington, D.C., not having appropriate representation or plans for how to utilize the funding that comes from Washington, D.C. That's another objective of our RFBC, is how do we connect each of our regions to more of these resources?
Thank you for letting us know that. I'm wondering, there is kind of a disconnect, at least in some of the other territories that I'm working in, because a lot of the traditional food culture has been replaced by a lot of these imported and processed foods. Do you find that it is a challenge for the local populations to readopt their native food cultures that are indigenous to Hawaii? And when you're growing more and more food on the island, is it going to the local populations, or is it also going to a more touristic area or hotels and things like that?
Yeah, great question. And I just have to absolutely agree with you. We have food deserts all over the place, especially in very many rural areas, but also in urban areas. I think when we talk about food deserts, sometimes we forget the rural areas, right? And so access to food is huge, not only because of affordability or proximity to purchasing healthy food, but what you mentioned in terms of culturally appropriate food. That's very important. What we've seen as we put in more culturally appropriate foods in the distributions that food hubs work with is that we get extremely good feedback from families that thank you for sharing this with us. We have not had access or we have not consumed this food as much as we would like to, and it means a lot to us. But part of that is what you're saying. People are used to processed foods, and if they get a quorum of taro, which is one of the very important foods here in Hawaii, or kalo, as we say in Hawaii, they don't exactly know how to process it. You have to peel it, you have to boil it, but it's not exactly a white potato. And so some of our food hubs, like Hawaii Ulu Cooperative, have processed those cultural starches to make them recipe ready. And that just means that you can, they've been part cooked already and minimally processed. And so we're finding that as one step to providing more cultural access. But that re-education is important. There's a lot of people that do not know exactly how to utilize the cultural foods, and that is a big focus of ours in the RFBC and in Hawaii Good Food Alliance. The other question you asked is actually, from my perspective, not a black or white kind of situation. We do have plenty of tourists on our islands, and we also have a lot of local people that need local food. Just to give you a figure, I think we spend roughly $10 billion every year on food in Hawaii. And that's combining the tourists and the local population. And so when you look at it, the tourist is spending a little bit over half of that money. And so our local population in Hawaii is right above 1 million people that they eat food every day and every week. But in a given week, you have about 200,000 to 300,000 tourists. And so you can see that, yes, tourists are spending just the same amount as local people, but they're about 4 or 5 times less in population. So they're spending quite a lot of money on local food. But when we check in with people, when we check in with our farmers and with our food hubs to say, is tourism taking away from your ability to serve your local community? That is almost never true, because a lot of the hotels and restaurants have been so supportive to local food producers and food hubs that they've actually helped scale them up so that they can serve the local community. So in the process of scaling up, many of our local food entrepreneurs, they didn't lose sight of their original motivations to support local communities. And as you know, many of our places lack any kind of resources for agriculture and for farmers to get bigger or to expand their production or to find labor. And so the fact that restaurants and hotels have been willing to pay for local food on a consistent basis has actually helped us grow our local food system. Another interesting thing, and I don't know how common this is in other places, but in Hawaii, it was actually a group of chefs back in the early 90s that got together and created something called the Hawaii Regional Cuisine. So many of those chefs were faced with a very similar challenge that our schools and institutions are faced with today, is how do we have steady supply and consistency of local food? And so they were part of actually forming some of the initial food hubs, one on the big island of Hawaii called Adaptations. And so they've gone through the challenges of not wanting to rely on imported foods. They started these trends. And so in a sense, we can learn quite a lot from these chefs that value local food, but have also been able to increase the supply of it over time.
That's amazing. That's really reassuring to hear. And I'm kind of hearing that everywhere, that there is this resurgence of interest in local food and supporting local farmers, because you can't really have amazing food if your produce is, sitting on a ship for 2 weeks. So really fostering the local agriculture and the local economy will inevitably give you the best results in the kitchen. And it's this beautiful synergy that I'm seeing all over the place. From the Virgin Islands, they have the Bush Cook on St. Croix. Even in Florida, they have the Florida Local Foods Group. So yeah, it's really exciting. Thank you for sharing those success stories. I'm wondering, since I did meet you in St. Croix, I'm wondering if you and the other regional food business centers have anything that you're working on in the future that you're able to disclose. Is there something happening that is of interest or exciting to you?
Absolutely. There's so many things. We're just come out of one year of planning with each of our communities. We do have a general framework for our RFBC. We do want to improve food access. We want to improve business viability of local farms and food hubs. We want to strengthen our network. So all of this we share in common, but our design was deliberately informed by people on the ground. So we were from the beginning at peace with U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, having priorities that matter to them. Hawaii and Alaska and other places also having priorities that matter to them. So this is our big challenge. There's no other RFBC that is so focused on bringing up the priorities from the ground and bottom up, and which is making us have to work more, but we're finding ourselves more accountable to our communities. And so the exciting thing, I think, for all of us is that there's going to be grant programs coming out for our technical assistants and for our businesses. And so in Hawaii, we are actually publishing our technical assistance grants this month and within this week. And Puerto Rico published them, I think, last week, and U.S. Virgin Islands is working on theirs. And then our business builder grants, which are going to go directly to local food producers or food businesses that are working on marketing efforts, are going to come out early next year. So there's tons of very exciting programs coming out. And at the same time, we're all learning together, because a few years ago, we found a commonality in our visions and our values. And we found each other in different settings, where I heard Summer speak and I'm like, wow, that's what we do. I need to talk more to this woman, and now we're like family. We've been to each other's places several times, but the big difference is that we actually have quite a lot of funding now. So we need to put all of our visions into practice and into implementation. So in that, I think one of the most exciting things is that we can learn from each other. So we're part of this community of practice that meet every month. We get together at least once a year as a full RFBC, but quite often a little bit more than that. And we're just finding it natural nowadays to lift up the phone and give each other a call and say, have you ever had this challenge before? Or have you responded to this kind of opportunity? And so that's where we're at. U.S. Virgin Islands, I think, just to give you some insight, and you might already be aware of this, but they're working quite a lot on their farm to school. So they're going to be focusing on aggregating small farms, looking at standing up a food hub, and then getting that food into the farm to school. That's just one of the initiatives, but they're also working on how do we get our backyard growers more and more into the food system? How do we organize them? We went to some backyards, including Summer's mother, that grows over 50 kinds of herbs and fruits and vegetables in her backyard and have a beautiful sharing with her neighbor. But we know that during disasters, during hurricanes, those foods become really important. So how do we build networks among those is part of the things that they're working on.
That's really powerful. It's very cool to see these players that I know have this funding from a large organization, but then the actual implementation is so grassroots and really uplifting the local farmers. It's very exciting because I was out in May for about 2 weeks with Southern SARE visiting farms on the three islands. And that is true that, there is a lot of production in people's backyards, but actually getting it somewhere where people could buy it that's not just a roadside stand is really the challenge. So when you go to the grocery store, maybe there's some local cucumbers or maybe some bananas, but that's really it. So there's like this disconnect between the production and being able to actually buy it. So I'm really excited to see how everything develops with you guys, and you have to keep me updated if there's any interesting news or maybe another summit in Hawaii coming up.
Absolutely. So happy to keep you updated. But also the other thing is, like, when we met in U.S. Virgin Islands, it was a very special time. That was their first food summit. And if you recall, they had intentionally invited farmers and institutions from Puerto Rico. And just the camaraderie that we observed between these two places where the water connects them and they're so close to each other, but people speak different languages. But the connections that were made between the farmers in Puerto Rico and the farmers in U.S. Virgin Islands was very beautiful to see. Everything from sharing seed catalogs to talking about values and talking about different opportunities. I see a big, bright future with that kind of development of Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands working closer together on their food systems representation. And so I think that's going to be very exciting to see where that goes in the future.
Definitely. I really want to thank you for sharing your time, and you have a really beautiful energy. So I just feel really honored that we were able to connect not only in the Virgin Islands, but here today and kind of discuss some of the challenges, but also the bright future that the Regional Food Business Center and the Food Hub in Hawaii is creating. So thank you so much for your time and just enlightening us with everything that's going on.
Thank you too. It's been great to be here. Thanks for the important work you do. And I'm looking forward to see what comes to us in the future around food hubs and connecting our territories. So please keep me in the loop.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. And is there anything that you want to plug? Where can people find you? I can put everything in the show notes, but what do you have going on? Where can people connect with you? Anything else you want to talk about?
Absolutely. So we have a website that's called Islands and Remote Areas RFBC, Regional Food Business Center. That's where we will be updating all the opportunities that come from each of our subregions, whether it's U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and all of the other subregions. So we'll be updating that website here shortly because the baseline assessment that each of the regions have been working on will be published there soon. There'll be a SWOT analysis and a food systems review. So some of those resources, but also every time there's an opportunity coming up, it'll be published on that website. So just wanted to share that with you. And again, thank you so much. You and your organization does amazing work. And so thanks for being out there and representing our small farms and food sustainability.
Thank you so much for saying that. Well, thank you so much. And I hope everybody enjoyed this podcast. And please check out the website and buy as much local produce as you can afford to support your local farming communities.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week. And until then, keep on farming.